Hello and welcome to Spyhards podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, booking a flight to the Bahamas.
Oh, it's so sunny and tropical here. I've got my toes in the sand, and someone's aiming a harpoon gun at me.
Duck, Scott, duck! You've got episodes to record.
Quack? Quack?
Uh-oh.
Oh, he's lost it, folks. He's lost it. No, we are just coming off of our massive dive into The Man with the Golden Gun last week. A fantastic review. We had a great guest. If you haven't checked that episode out yet, go have a listen to that afterwards. A hilarious time with a bit too much foo yuck was partaken of, in that episode, I would say.
Yes, I would say there was quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yes, that and Tabasco sauce.
I'm still rinsing the Tabasco off of me. That's why I'm actually in the ocean right now.
You made it rain with that Tabasco.
Is that a John Rain joke?
It was. It was a connection.
That was our guest. Anyway, speaking of guests, we did promise this last week. We've got a bumper double episode for you this week. It's a double feature, if you will. We are sitting down with someone truly very special, but we're keeping the James Bond magic going. Cam, who are we talking to?
Yes, we are talking to Robert Sellers, the author of the 2007 book, The Battle for Bond, a very controversial book, as we'll get to in the interview.
Yeah, one of the only books to ever be pulped in the UK. There is a list of them, but a very small list, and it's crazy to think a James Bond book was banned. And there's a lot to discuss. And also, we go through the history of the story of Thunderball, from its creation through to the litigation later on down the road. Robert Sellers is a historian, a Bond historian, but he's written a lot of books. He knows a lot about Thunderball, which we'll get into. But this turned out to be sort of a gargantuan interview. I think it went 2.5 hours in the end, and we thought we would try breaking it up into two halves for you. The first half, obviously, at the time you're listening, and if you're listening to it contemporaneously, the second part will be out later this week. If you listen to it in the future, you can play them back to back.
Yeah, exactly. Convenience.
I love it. But yeah, there's a lot to get into, so I think without further ado, let's get to the interview. Well, Cam, we've got some murky waters to chart this week. We're looking at 007 taking on the big screen, and I can't think of a better man to speak to about this because he literally wrote the book. On the show with us, he's a writer and author. His books include The Battle for Bond, Peter O'Toole, The Definitive Biography, When Harry Met Cubby, the story of James Bond producers, and of course, The Search for James Bond. It is the one and only. It's Robert Sellers. Hello, sir. How are you?
Hi, guys. How are you? Nice to be on.
It's good to have you here. We profess to be experts, but then we're actually faced with an actual expert. We will look rather meager compared to you, I think.
Well, I wouldn't say natural expert. I mean, it helps when you've got a lot of research. I rely very much on research. I have, it's like an actor, who's publicising a new film we probably made 2 years ago, and he's made 3 since, and he has to dredge it all up again, But I'm a Bond fan. I'm a natural. I can talk about Bond, but normally when I'm publicising a book, I have to go back and read the bloody thing, because I have to remember it all because I'm on to the next thing, you see.
Well, yeah, that's your job. You're a novelist. You create these things, and I think like the history of the book of The Battle for Bond is an absolutely fascinating one that I want to get into. But the history that you tackle in the book, which is sort of bringing James Bond to the big screen, that story, and then the sort of waves that created with McCallum and Never Say Never Again, Warhead, etc., is just a fascinating tale that I think not enough Bond fans know enough about. Because a lot of people will think there are 25 films and that's the end of it. And there is far more to this story than you might know.
Yeah. I think because I'm older than you guys, so I go back to sort of the early 70s. And even then, the name McCallum was around, when there weren't very many books on Bond when I was growing up. I think the first book ever written on the James Bond films was by John Brosnan. It was called James Bond in the Cinema. I think it came out in the mid-70s or something. And I remember buying that in a bookstore, and it was the only Bond book you could ever have, nothing else to be published on the subject. And I, read it from cover to cover about 7 times growing up. Now, it's all over the place. But even then, even in that book, the story of McCallum was there. He wasn't completely hidden. but there wasn't much detail about it. It was just that there was this mysterious Irish maverick guy, this wannabe filmmaker was going to make a Bond film before, and it was going to be Thunderball. And that was about all you got. And it's so there was a mystery about it and a mystery about him, which weirdly enough, when I started writing the book, I wasn't actually wanting to search for the true mystery of McClory. Really, I just wanted to make a book or write a book about my favorite Bond film, which was Thunderball. It started life as a sort of a celebration of Thunderball. Not really wanting to go into the minutiae of the court case, obviously mentioning it, but not going into huge detail. So it was going to be just almost a love letter to my favorite Bond film. Originally, things changed, of course, when I started writing it.
Well, I want to dig into that for a second. What is it about Thunderball, a movie that is often very polarizing with Bond fans nowadays? What is it about that one that makes it your favorite?
It's weird, isn't it? It's a guilty pleasure almost, because it's not the best Bond film by a long shot. Sometimes your favorite Bond film or your favorite music or whatever is not, the best. It's always a sort of a guilty pleasure, isn't it? I think the best Bond film is probably From Russia with Love or Goldfinger, Secret Service. They're probably the best Bond films. But my favorite Bond film when I was growing up, I distinctly remember, was Diamonds Are Forever. Weirdly enough.
Oh, okay.
I distinctly remember that being my favorite. I don't know why. Probably because it's quite comedy based, isn't it? It's quite funny.
Mhm.
It's quite camp. It's like a Batman episode almost, isn't it? So I think that appealed to me when I was young, that it had this really interesting dark black humor. But then later on, I think I went to see it at the National Film Theatre because I'd never seen the Bond films growing up on the cinema screen. I'd always watched them on television. And I think I went to see Thunderball at the National Film Theatre in about 1980. They were showing a season of Bond films. And I went to see it on the big screen, and the underwater battle just blew me away. And I was watching it again after that. And yes, I thought I slowly developed a passion for it. Why I think it's good, I think it's a bridge, isn't it? It's sort of a bridge between the old style of Bond film, sort of Dr. No from Russia with Love, the sort of serious spy Bond movie, and the sort of outlandish Bond movie. Sort of Spy Love Me meets From Russia with Love in a way, because it has sort of grandiose set pieces, and gadgets, and exotic locations, but it also has a bit of espionage. It's still tethered to the book. It's still tethered to Fleming in a way. I think it's the best of both worlds.
It's one of those films, I think, that it does benefit from seeing it on the big screen. I have seen it both at home and on the big
I
screen.
think so.
And yeah, I don't count myself a flag waving fan of Thunderball personally. I find it to be quite laborious at times with the underwater sequences. That's me though.
Yes, it does flag. Yeah, I think most Bond films actually are flabby. I think most Bond films could do the trim.
Except for Quantum of Solace, that needs more fat on it, really.
Yeah. But Goldfinger's probably the perfect example, isn't it? Goldfinger is under 110 minutes. It's 10 minutes under 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's perfect. I think any Bond film that goes over 2 hours starts to get a bit flabby. But more Bond is better than less Bond, so we can't complain.
No, it's a whole new world of it now.
Mm.
Well, that is a good jumping off point, I think, for the book of The Battle for Bond, which is, you were looking to make a book celebrating your favorite Bond film, Thunderball. How did that spiral into really telling the story of 007's journey to the big screen?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about wanting to do a book on your favorite Bond had never been done.
Mm.
I don't think anybody had written a book on a specific Bond film. I think that was another reason of wanting to do it, because no one had done it. I always like to do things that no one's done, instead of doing regurgitating things. And I thought, well, no one's written a book about just one Bond movie. They have since, haven't they? I think there's a very good book on.
There's a few.
Yeah, Living Daylight, Secret Service. And this book on Goldfinger as well. Bloomsbury did a book on Goldfinger.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I've got those.
but when I wrote Battle for Bond, no one had done a book on a specific Bond, so that was another reason for doing it as well. So yes, I think I started interneting and googling and trying to get people who are still alive that worked on the film, and I came across a website um, belonging to Sylvan Mason Whittingham, um, whose father was Jack Whittingham, who wrote the original script or was hired by McClory to write the script of the proposed Bond film, Thunderball. And I got in touch with her because I thought she'd be interesting to talk to about her father, about if she can remember him writing the script or if she's got any letters from him or anything like that. And it turned out that she had an archive of material, and I went over to her house, and there were I remember this still. It was um, amazing afternoon. Walking into her living room, and there was in the middle of the floor were about 5 or 6 cardboard boxes on top of each other, and he literally blowing the dust off them. They'd obviously come from some warehouse somewhere. They've probably been stored there for years, and they had sort of string round them, and I undid them. And for the next hour, 3 hours, I was just looking through all this amazing material. And the book obviously changed right there because I realized what I'd found. I found the entire court case, the entire history of this first attempt to make a Bond film, all the letters, texts, artwork, location reports, you name it. It was quite an astonishing find, really. And the bulk of the book is based on all those papers that I discovered.
Well, when you're finding all of this material, it's I'm sure blowing your mind, but was there any details that in particular you were just like, I found the Holy Grail here. Like this in particular is absolutely mind blowing.
I think the whole thing. I think you're right. It was like finding the Holy Grail, particularly for um, the kind of book that I like writing because I like writing um, books where I can get first-hand information either through interviews or from archive material, and there it was right in front of me. And for me, the most remarkable aspect of it was there must have been about 400 letters over a 3-year period from all the main people involved. So there were Fleming, McClory, and then you had people like Ivor Bryce, who was a close friend of Fleming, who was the money. He was the one really who was the backer, and Ernest Cuneo as well, who was a friend of Fleming, who was sort of involved in the writing as well, um, and various other people as well. But mainly those 4 people were writing to each other for about 2.5 years, and all of those letters were there. And I remember um, we copied everything. She very kindly went to her local newsagent who had a photocopy machine, and she must have spent hours, days photocopying all this stuff because we're talking thousands. Must have been thousands of bits of paper, and I had a bulk, maybe this more in the screen, maybe about 3, 5 feet high of letters from all these 4 guys, and I went through them and I put them in the right date, and it took me about a week to read them, and then I had to read them again. So the last letter made sense because of the third letter, if you see what I mean. Um, and that told the story. It just told the whole story in their own words of how it started, and then halfway through how it started to go wrong. And it was fascinating. It was almost like reading a thriller book, but in the words of the protagonists. Um, and what was interesting was the sort of enthusiasm in the early days, in those early letters about looking forward to getting Bond on screen, and we can't wait, and who's going to play the villain, and who's going to be Bond. And then halfway through, you start. I think Fleming starts worrying about McClory, that if he's the right man, and then developing sort of undercover tactics to get him off the project. And then it all goes pear-shaped, of course. But it was fascinating. I wish I could. That's the reason. Well, we might go into the reason why Battle for Bond is not there isn't going to be another edition. I mean, what I would love to do is just print all those letters, so people just read the whole story just by the letters. Each page is a different letter. It'd be about 200 pages long, and you can just read the whole thing. And it's that itself would be a fascinating read for Bond fans.
It's yeah, I kind of want to get into some of the contents in there because I've gone through what you presented in the first edition before it was edited down to the second edition,
Yeah.
and absolutely fascinating. And you're right, hearing it from the people themselves, like seeing Fleming's mind change, he's
Absolutely,
exposed
yeah.
more to people around him as people like Hitchcock become involved, and he starts to realize, The Boy in the Bridge isn't a very successful film, and the gleam comes off the rose for McClory. He's not the be all and end all anymore. It is almost a shame. I mean, I don't have much of an opinion on Kevin McClory. I've got some thoughts, but maybe we'll come to that too. But there's it's clear that Kevin McClory wanted this to happen. He was the big cheerleader of a Bond film happening back then, and you can see everything sort of turning against him. Be that a good or a bad thing, and obviously we've ended up in the good timeline where Bond films prospered through Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli, but it is really sort of putting myself in McClory's position there. It's quite sad to read that tonal change as people are like talking about freezing him out with shares in the company and stuff like that. It's like, oh, we are really talking about someone behind their back through telegram and through letter. It's a tough read.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they forged documents. It got to that stage. Some of the company documents were sort of altered, shall we say? But yeah, I mean, he was his worst enemy, really, Kevin, because he wasn't experienced. I mean, he was an ideas man, really. He was sort of a go-getter type, like Mike Todd, who was his mentor. He did Marriage to Elizabeth Taylor and did Around the World in 80 Days, which Kevin worked on. And I think he modelled himself very much on Mike Todd, who was very much a showman, sort of a filmmaker, showman type of person. But he only had one film to his name, which was The Boy in the Bridge, which they were hoping would be a huge success, which it was never going to be, really, was it? It was always going to be an art house film, but it wasn't well received critically either. And Kevin was sort of gallivanting around the place, going to Cannes and going to the Venice Film Festival and spending an awful lot of money on hiring private yachts and getting lots of reporters to come and drink lots of expensive champagne and caviar, and he was wasting a lot of money. And I think Fleming started to get, because they did. I think he was worried for his friend, really, because Ivor Bryce was losing money on it, and I think Fleming was a bit guilty that this was his. I mean, Bond was his baby, but his friend was sort of bankrolling it, and I think he was afraid that his friend was going to not get bankrupted, but was going to get really seriously financially hit. So I think he didn't want to bail out, but I think he started to, as you say, that the rose started to wither.
And there's also a real you talk about it in your book, but it's a sort of a class system thing going on here too. Kevin McClory, someone that I can kind of understand, working class myself, coming from a working class background. I do get that sort of luster of that lifestyle that he was sort of found himself in, working in the film industry and becoming a producer and a director. But for people like Fleming and Ivor Bryce and all that sort of stuff, that was kind of what they were used to. It wasn't a big deal to them. And it is sort of this weird idea of this this person who's entered this world and is just amazed by it and wants to do everything, is going to all these film festivals. I almost understand his want to do that because he's living his dream, which is pretending to be of the upper class.
Very much so. I mean, I've experienced that weirdly with the Battle for Bond. This guy wanted to make a film out of it, and I think he was a self-made man, and you could tell that he was loving the life. He was telling me, we're going to Cannes next week. He loved meeting film stars, and he came from humble beginnings. And I think you get, I mean, Kevin was, if you met somebody in a party or something who was a bit more, should we say, of a different class, who sort of looked down at Kevin, and he'd just take his wallet out and show him all the money in his wallet. So that's my That's my background. That's who I am now. So yeah, there was an element of snobbishness, but I think Fleming looked down on quite a lot of people. I think.
Lots of different types of people too,
Yeah, yeah,
unfortunately from the books. But
yeah.
yeah, Fleming is an interesting character for sure. One name that jumps out to me from those early stages before we get to actual Thunderball happening and stuff is Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah.
It's only a couple of chapters in the book about his involvement, but from the idea of having Jimmy Stewart having to do it, I thought that whole there is a world where the first Bond film was Alfred Hitchcock directed, and I have to wonder what that could have been like, and just maybe I'll ask you sort of the question: what were your thoughts on reading all about that and the possibilities?
Well, again, it was I wouldn't say a myth, but again, it was something that in Bond books and Bond articles, it was always there, wasn't it? Alfred Hitchcock. There are stories that he might have made so to actually see the proof, because it was sort of a legend, no one had proved it. It was always, was Hitchcock involved in the first Bond film? Was he ever approached? And in those boxes, I came across, the telex from Hitchcock saying, I'm in Paris at the moment, and he was interested in looking at it, and they were going to have a meeting. So he was approached. Fleming was very good friends with Eric Ambler, and Eric Ambler had worked with Fleming, with Hitchcock. So he was sort of the conduit between them. And Fleming asked Eric Ambler to send the script to Hitchcock. Hitchcock read it all and did reply. But I think Fleming was very keen for Hitchcock. Bryce less so, because Bryce had contacts in Hollywood who told him that Hitchcock takes over projects. They become a Hitchcock production. As opposed to, because Bryce and Fleming were hoping to go into the movie business. They'd started their own company, Xanadu, and it wasn't. They were worried that it wouldn't be a Xanadu production; it'd be a Hitchcock production. But Fleming was sort of wide-eyed at the thought of Hitchcock, because it was a marquee name, of course, that it guaranteed success almost. But it sort of withered on the vine, really. Hitchcock never came to London. He stayed in Paris, and then he went back to America, and it never happened. But there were reports in these letters that, if Hitchcock wanted to do it, he preferred, or his choice of actor would have been James Stewart, which is a bit strange to think of now. But Hitchcock had worked with him, Rear Window, Man Who Knew Too Much. He was one of his favorite actors. So Cary Grant would have been, I think, much better, because of course Hitchcock had worked with Cary Grant many times, North by Northwest, Catch a Thief. So I'm surprised Hitchcock thought Jimmy Stewart rather than Cary Grant. But there we go. But the what's interesting is Fleming's enthusiasm for James Stewart, saying, I don't mind James Stewart if he can slightly anglicize his accent. And Ivor Bryce said, I can't believe you think Jimmy Stewart would make a good Bond. So again, I think that's quite interesting. It shows that Fleming was so desperate to get a Bond film off the ground that he would have countenanced anyone being Bond, I think. And it was up to his friends to sort of knock him on the head and say, no, James Stewart cannot be Bond. So he was sort of dazzled by Hollywood, I think, Fleming.
Well, I was going to actually ask about that. Was, from your research, how naive did Ian Fleming seem in regards to Hollywood and movie making?
Well, I think he'd been sort of scarred a bit by rejection, because he'd been trying to get a Bond onto the screen for many years, hadn't he? And I think many film studios in the UK and in America had been offered the Bond books and rejected them, really. So I think this is why he was so, Kevin McClory, this sort of very enthusiastic but with no experience whatsoever. he sort of gave him the rights to make a Bond film, because by then he was so desperate, because he knew that the big majors weren't interested. So maybe this mad Irish guy can do it, because he's a bit of a maverick and a go-getter, and you never know. But so but and also, I mean, he didn't know how to write a script either, a film script, because also in these boxes were three Fleming scripts, which are very interesting. I mean, I go into them in quite good detail in the books. Um, they're fascinating to read, but they're not filmed. They're very bad film scripts, because they're written almost like a book.
Mm.
I don't think Fleming. This is why they brought Jack Whittingham on, because he was a professional screenwriter. The thing with a film script, it has to be it's a film is a visual medium, so a film script has to be very linear. But Fleming's scripts were very bogged down in explanation and dialogue. There wasn't much visual sense in them, which is interesting actually. He learnt as he went along. This third one is better than the first one. He's learning as he's going along, because people are telling him this is not how you write a film script. And by the third one, it's actually becoming a little bit more. He's getting it. But by then, they decided to bring in a professional screenwriter, Jack Whittingham, who took it over and produced what was the first James Bond film script.
So with Ian Fleming's drafts there, I was just curious from, your point of view. We know who Bond is in terms of the cinematic world. It's very specific. Who was Bond, the first cinematic Bond, in the eyes of Ian Fleming?
Himself, probably.
Hmm.
Um, but also, I think obviously people he'd met in the war. Obviously, because he worked in British naval intelligence, so obviously he would have met real spies and real spy masters. I think people like Q and M probably worked in that building during the war. But I think Bond was very much himself. I think it was a wish fulfillment, wasn't it? I think he was terrified of getting married. I don't know, how old was he when he got married? I think he was in his 40s, wasn't he, when he got married? He was a bit of a playboy, wasn't he, and a bit of an adventurer, and
Bit of a cad.
yes, absolutely. Played around, drank, smoked, drove fast cars. He was James Bond, wasn't he? Very much. So I think the terror of getting married and leaving his bachelor world behind, I think he created this alter ego that could live what he could no longer live. You know what I mean? He could write about this character going out and screwing all these women and blowing things up and driving fast cars, and he couldn't do that anymore. So yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, because I bring this up because, like, in the Ian Fleming books, there's often a little bit of a melancholy to the Bond
Mm,
character, kind of acknowledging the difficulties of the life, versus when you watch a lot of the cinematic Bonds, you
mm.
don't get that so much outside of maybe the Daniel Craig films, and that's why I asked. Yeah.
I was going to say you get yeah, you get it now, don't you? But yeah, there's not much reflection in the early films. There's
No.
and there's a scene also, isn't there, in is it Tomorrow Never Dies, where he's in the hotel room waiting for Terry Hatcher to come, and he's got the bottle of vodka there, and it's almost a very Fleming-esque moment, because he's sort of in reflective mood, isn't he, there? But yes, you don't get it at all in the Rogers, do you? Maybe for about 5 seconds.
Was there any of that in the Fleming drafts? Like, did that sort of like melancholy and kind of
No, no,
no?
not really. No, no, there wasn't. No, there was. It was. No, no, that I can remember. And I think it would come to me if there was specifically something. I mean, there may be elements of it, but there isn't sort of a moment like, the beginning of Goldfinger, where he's in the airport, lounge, and he's just killed somebody, and he's saying, is this the kind of person I am, that I'm killing? So no, there wasn't. It was there's one section where there's a voiceover, and it's like, my name's Bond, James Bond. I work at MI5, and it's almost like Dragnet almost in that way. This kind of, these are the men who work for MI5. They have the music, and lift doors open, and people, secretaries are rushing out. It's very much that there's that in it, yeah. But which is interesting.
It's so interesting.
I never thought of that before. That's really interesting. Because Fleming Bond is very reflective in all the books, isn't he? Pretty much.
Yeah.
That didn't transpose itself into the Thunderball script. Maybe because this was the first film that they didn't want. Maybe if this beginning film had worked, maybe Fleming in the next one would have wanted a little bit more of the book Bond coming in. That kind of melancholy. But in the first one, they just wanted a bang, didn't they? This is Bond, and this is what he does. Yeah, because they had to sell it to Hollywood, didn't they? They couldn't. I think they, maybe Hollywood would have rejected that kind of character. A melancholic kind of hero. I think it was too early for that, really. I guess Bond is the first anti-hero, maybe, but he couldn't be the first anti-hero that early. I don't think people would have accepted it. I don't know.
Right. And I was just going to ask, have you ever seen the movie FBI Story with James Stewart?
Many, many years ago, yes. But so I'm not familiar with it, but I do remember seeing it one Sunday afternoon. Yeah.
I just asked because you mentioned those early drafts having kind of a Dragnet feel. And I look at something like James Stewart in that movie, and I think, well, hold on. Like, if Hitchcock wants James Stewart, there is a certain tone he has there that you could easily apply to a more, stricter kind of authoritative Bond if you want to make that movie.
But what's interesting was coming back to now is that he didn't want any Americanisms. Because he wrote this, which I think I reproduced in the book. He wrote this, what we call a Bible, don't we? When you've got a show running, you write a Bible, which all the writers who come on that show read it, so they know where the characters are going and all that kind of stuff. And he wrote some notes, and he was saying that even though this is essentially a fantasy, it has to be treated with utter seriousness. Or MI5 has to be treated almost in a documentary realism way, which I thought was interesting.
It's interesting you bring up FBI Story as well, because that comes out in 1959, same year as North by Northwest, and that's kind of where a lot of this is converging around that time as well.
Yes.
I kind of want to get into the story of like the actual process of writing the book, but there's one thing I can't go past this sort of finding these letters without mentioning, which is one of the original ideas for a Bond film. And you've got some wonderful illustrations in there. I think is it done? Someone connected to John Huston put those together. I think the illustrations.
That's right. Yes. Oh God, what was his name? Anyways, he was the art director on various Hitchcock Huston films. He was the art director on Moulin Rouge, and he was the art director on Moby Dick, and obviously Kevin had a very good relationship with Huston because he'd worked on Moby Dick with him, and I think he asked this art director guy they were going to the Venice Film Festival with Boy in the Bridge, but they wanted to also do sort of pre-production or publicity for we are doing Bond next, and I think Kevin asked this art director to draw some. It's like the Ralph McQuarrie Star Wars storyboards that George Lucas used to sell Star Wars when he went round to all the Hollywood studios. He would say, "This is what it's going to look like." And I think Kevin had that idea, and he got this art director guy whose name you'll be telling me in a moment.
Oh, Stephen Grimes.
Stephen Grimes, that's it.
There we go.
Yeah,
The reason I mention the designs, because I mean, seeing someone visualize a Bond film way before a Bond film was ever visualized, and how similar it actually looks to what we eventually do get in Bond, but also in Thunderball itself. It's interesting to just think that, like, not to sort of play down what Cubby and Harry did, but there must have been something that was translatable within that text that people could pick up on and sort of turn into this work.
It was the first visual realization of what Bond could look like on celluloid, because even the Bond novels didn't have a representation of the story on the cover. They were all quite stylized, weren't they? It was like a frog
Yeah.
and a gun, or a petal and a
Some
car.
cards and a
Oh,
skeleton
yes,
hand and stuff
exactly.
like that.
There was no image of Bond on a beach or anything like that. So this
Mm.
was literally the first visual interpretation of Bond in a way. You'd had the Daily Express serialization, of course, hadn't you?
Mhm.
But that as a film, what a film would look like, a Bond film, and they're fascinating. And I remember, looking at those and being blown away, and I didn't know what they were at first, and then I came across some information in a letter or something saying that Kevin McClory had asked Stephen Grimes to draw sort of pre-production pictures of what the film could look like, which I think he must have blown up into huge placards or banners, and he hung them up at the Venice Film Festival that year, to generate interest, to try and get more backers. And they weren't. I don't think they're anywhere else. I think that they were in that box, and that's it. They haven't come up anywhere else. I don't think so.
I mean, you can find some of them online now because people have taken them from your book.
Yes,
But
they have.
yeah.
But they're out
The
there
reason I
now.
bring that up, it's in there now, which I think goes against some of the arguments that the Ian Fleming Foundation makes. But we'll come back to that. One of the things I find interesting about the early sections in the book is also the proposed story. One of the early stories that before it gets more refined, I think really before Jack Whittingham turns up, which is this idea of like this cabaret USO show, and Bond being taught by Laurence Olivier and Noel Coward, kind of taking things from 80 Days, and just think like, what a bizarre world that would have been. If you could just sort of expand on that story a little bit for those who haven't read the book, the original sort of pitch.
That's the original. I think they all had this meeting, didn't they? McClory, Bryce, Fleming, Cuneo, and I think that evening Cuneo wrote it down, and then it was sort of expanded a little bit. And yeah, it's almost like the plot for Octopussy. Actually, they're going to put a bomb on an American air base, which is what happens in Octopussy, isn't it, to some extent? And it was the USO, which is sort of an entertainment group, isn't it? It's like ENSA, the British ENSA during the Second World War. It's an entertainment group that go around all the American bases, army bases, and give shows to the troops. And the baddies infiltrate this entertainment troupe, and they're going to put a bomb on one of the bases. Bond hears about it and has to get into the entertainment, into this troupe. So yes, he goes to various. I think Noel Coward as well was going to be in it, teaching them to sing little ditties, and then Laurence Olivier gives them some diction lessons and stuff.
Please tell me there's a Bob Hope cameo.
Oh God!
Please tell me.
That would be great. I think actually Frank Sinatra, when because he's in the Bahamas, isn't it? And Frank Sinatra is singing while they're planting the bomb. It's like bloody Live Aid, isn't it? But these were friends of Fleming, of course. Noel Coward. I could have seen it happening. Noel Coward was a very good friend of Fleming, and Noel Coward knew Olivier. So those two names are mentioned because they knew probably that they could get them. But what's interesting about that early sort of storyline, before the script was even written, was there was always going to be an underwater battle. There was always going to be this incredible epic battle underwater. That was always going to be the climax, and that never changed. And so that was very far-reaching to think of that. How they thought they were going to actually technically do that in 1959, I have no idea. It would have been an absolute disaster, I think, if it had been made. Because Broccoli and Saltzman were very canny in doing Doctor No First, which is pretty straightforward book.
It's like two locations. I think it's England and Jamaica, basically, and yeah.
And they were very clever with the production design. I mean, Ken Adam worked miracles on the budget. But so technically, to have done all that underwater stuff, it would have been a nightmare.
So I suppose then, going back to sort of telling the story of the creation of the book, you're sat in that living room with this bundle of information, and that obviously that light goes off in your head, and you're like, I've got something here. Because
Yeah.
we've done some interviews in the past with people and found some bits of information that have been new to the Bond sort of
Mm.
legacy that I'm hoping that have been referenced in books that have been printed since, and we're pretty proud of that. But they pale in comparison to the find you had on that day. And I kind of know what that feeling is, but nowhere near just what you felt then. Did
Yeah.
you sort of have a sensation at that moment? You're like, this is a real important moment.
Absolutely. Because I mean, it's like you guys. If you'd have found that, you being Bond fans, you know exactly what you've got. You know that this stuff hasn't been seen before. You know that this I mean, they had sort of binders of letters from agents saying, this actor can play Bond. There were people writing to the office suggesting their husband, who was in the Royal Marines, can play Bond. Extraordinary letters coming in from housewives all over the country saying, my husband is 6 foot tall, he's very handsome, he'd be a wonderful James Bond. And they collected them all in this binder, and it was in one of the boxes, and it was just wonderful reading this stuff. It really was. So yes, it was amazing, and I've had that feeling before as well. Prior to this book, many years before, I'd written a book on handmade films, which is the film company, was the George Harrison Monty Python film company that made Life of Brian and With Nail and I and all those films. And again, I loved all those movies growing up. So I was going to do a very simple book on the making of those films. And one of the first people I interviewed was Stephen Woolley, producer Stephen Woolley, who did The Crying Game and Company of Wolves. But he did Mona Lisa, he produced Mona Lisa.
Right.
And I was expecting him to talk about, Bob Hoskins was lovely to work with. Michael Caine was great. He went on a 2-hour rant about Handmade, the person who owned Handmade, which was a guy called Dennis O'Brien, who was George Harrison's business manager.
Okay.
And he 2-hour tirade about how horrendous this guy was, and that moment the book completely changed. It became a completely different book. It became about Dennis O'Brien and how he destroyed this film company and how he almost bankrupted George Harrison. It became a completely different book. And it's great when that happens, actually, when you start off going down one road and then you suddenly swerve onto the next lane, ending up 20 miles away from where you thought you were going to be. And that was the same with this book as well. Because I wasn't expecting to find all this stuff. I didn't know it was out there. Especially in one place. You expect it to be in various places. Because I think there's an American Bond fanzine called GoldenEye. Have you heard of that? John Cork. You know John Cork?
We've had John Cork on the show.
Of course.
Yeah, he's a friend of ours. Yeah.
He had his own Bond fanzine called GoldenEye in the 90s, and they did a big article on Thunderball and they had some of the documents. It's a very authoritative article.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that documentation was out there in various places, but not all in one place. Just literally everything was in those. And the reason they were all there was because when the court case happened, all the documents, when you have a court case, you need all the documents in one place. So the prosecution and the defense had all of the documents. And these were the defense documents that were given to Kevin McClory. But because he never paid his typical Kevin story, he never paid his lawyers. So the lawyer kept the documents, never gave them to him.
Great.
Because he said, you ain't paying my fee, you're not getting the documents. Which when he came to do Never Say Never Again, and when he wanted to we're jumping ahead here, but when it came to Never Say Never Again, and the hope Kevin later on wanted to make more Bond films, he kept calling Silver and saying, did your dad write anything else that I can use? Did Bond go to Egypt? Did he do this? But I can, make a Bond film out of it. Because he didn't have the documents, you see. So he was always asking, is there anything in the documents that will give me another opportunity to do another Thunderball?
That's interesting because I mean I obviously saw some of that in the book, but it is like seeing Kevin sort of clawing and scratching and that process of putting Never Say Never Again together, and like the multiple times he had to sort of take it to Eon and get permission to use things, or
Yeah.
however that sort of process worked. It is because like he comes out with like Fatima Blush, and that character is from an early draft, which eventually became Fiona Volpe.
Yeah.
But it's stuff like that. But ultimately, he's never able to escape the orbit of the story of Thunderball. Like it will always be that. Same with Warhead; it's always still Thunderball.
I don't know why they didn't use Fatima Blush. That's a great name, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's better than Fiona Volpe, isn't it? Fatima Blush.
We're lucky enough to have spoken to both ladies on the show at this point, and I have a personal favourite of the two. But I think Fatima Blush. I mean, for me certainly, and for many people online, she's very much like Xenia Onatop prototype. That whole like pain pleasure thing. They obviously took some notes from Fatima Blush when they did Goldeneye.
Very much so. Yes, very much so. Yes, when I think the original ending was Bond and Bond and Domino kissing again. It's in the film, isn't it? When the bubbles all go up, but that was going to be the ending. You know, the kiss at the end. And there were roars of laughter in the court when this was read out, you know, because one of the lawyers said Bond ends up with the girl at the end, and the judge said, "Oh, he always does, doesn't he?" And everybody laughed in the.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Agents, we don't expect you to talk. We expect you to buy a subscription to our Patreon.
That's right. Over on the Spyhards Patreon, we're covering all your favorite spy TV shows, as well as popular films from the most iconic secret agent actors of all time.
Cam, why don't you share some intel on our latest assignment?
Scott, do you know what time it is? It's time to catch up on our April offerings over on the Patreon. That's right. We had reviews of The Jungle Book and Wallace and Gromit, Curse of the Were-Rabbit as part of our animated April celebration. Plus, we did an Andor Season 1 look back in preparation for Season 2. People, head on over. It's where the excitement is.
So deactivate Ghost Protocol and visit patreon.com/spyhards to truly do things angel style.
But before we close Channel D, on with the Spy Jinx. Well, I want to ask about Jack Whittingham, because his name has popped up a lot, and some people listening may not have a clue who he is, and not necessarily understand how he could be quite important in the evolution of Bond. Could you talk a little bit about his contributions?
Well, Jack was obviously highly experienced screenwriter. He'd worked for Ealing Studios. He'd worked for Disney. He did the Prince and the Pauper film for Disney. And he'd worked on television, or later on, he worked on television. He did a couple of episodes of Danger Man. But he was very experienced. And I think Kevin, I think his name was suggested to Kevin as someone who would be very good. Interestingly, the first person they went to was actually Paul Den, who wrote Goldfinger, and then later on wrote Murder on the Orient Express and some of the Planet of the Apes films. They went to Paul Den first, and he said he was too busy, but he sent them a few, hints and things that would help. And I think he suggested Jack Whittingham. So they approached him, and Jack came on, and that's all they needed really. They just needed a professional scriptwriter to write it as a script. By then, the scenario had changed a few times. And by the time Jack Whittingham came on, it was almost getting close to the Thunderball we know today. That storyline. Because prior to that, it was going to be the mafia. It was originally the mafia who were the baddies who were stealing the bombs, and then Fleming, of course, had this idea for a secret organization who were sort of non-political and in it for the money. Like the Tong or something like that, and he came up with the name Spectre. So Spectre was created for not a novel. Spectre was created for the Thunderball film, and Blofeld was created as well. And the weird thing is that Kevin didn't think much of that idea, and they went back. So in all the future drafts, Spectre does not appear again. It's always the Mafia. So it was the Mafia to start with. Then no, let's use Spectre. That was rejected, and then it became the Mafia. And it was only in the Broccoli Saltzman film that Spectre became the baddies. So that's it. That's interesting that Spectre was created for that film script. But yeah, very much Jack. I think his script is very professional, and I think it was something that they could show a proper Hollywood studio and they'd be taken seriously. Prior to that, the scripts, I mean, there were weird things. It was the baddie was his headquarters was in a nightclub, so you had Bond coming in as a burglar alarm repairman. And one of the cigarette girls was a female agent from MI6, and all that kind of thing. It was all a bit 50s hack, very, very sort of crime melodrama from the 50s. It was very much almost in the past, sort of very pulpy in a way.
Also leaning a bit towards sort of farce as well, like Bond coming in as a repairman. It takes itself a little less seriously.
It didn't work. It just didn't work at all. And they steal the bomb from Shoebury-Ness Atomic Station. There's a rocket test site in Shoebury-Ness, and they steal. And this is an example of why Fleming didn't work as or he didn't get a handle on how to write a film script. Is that the bombs are stolen from this rocket base by the baddies, and we don't in the script we don't see that. What happens is Bond arrives at M's office and there's a flap going on, and M explains what happened, and there's about 5 pages of dialogue, literally a whole page of M talking about what happened, about the robbery. So it wasn't seen visually; it was explained. So that's the novelist and not the screenwriter. And when Jack came in, he said, "No, you have to visualize that. You have to show it straight away. That's the beginning of the film. Is the that was what Jack brought. He brought a visual sense to the script and to the project. Yeah,
it's that classic like show don't tell adage, isn't it? Really, it's
absolutely. I don't think Fleming understood that. You see, unfortunately, he rammed his script full of dialogue. It was very dialogue heavy. It was almost like a potted book in a way, but his third one was a little bit more, as I say, a bit more tight. He was certainly learning.
You mentioned Jack Whittingham, but I was curious just from your research going through those papers and also just other research from doing other Bond books and putting this book together. Is there any other names that you think have perhaps been sort of lost in the history of times that deserve to be celebrated in those early stages of Bond? Ivor Bryce, Cuneo, stuff like that. Is there someone that I think that you think was very pivotal that perhaps isn't really given their credit?
Not really. Well, apart from the ones you've spoken about Kevin, and he's obvious, of course, but I think he does deserve a bit of credit.
I think so.
He's sort of painted as a villain, isn't he? He's painted as a villain. I mean, God help us if he'd got it off the ground, because we wouldn't be talking about James Bond today, that's for sure. Because I don't think it would have lasted more than 2 films, because I don't think he was the right person to do it. But he was, I think, the first person to sort of realize that Bond, the character Bond, he didn't like the novels. He told Fleming that as well. He said, "I don't think the novels are very good. They're very sort of." Again, what we were complaining about the Fleming scripts were, they were quite pulpy and they were quite sadistic. He thought they were, the sadism thing that Fleming has wouldn't work in a because the Bond films would have to be sort of family audience, general admittance. You can't have some of the sadism that were in the Bond novels in the films, because they wouldn't have been allowed. So he sensed that you couldn't film the books. That's why they came up with we need to create a brand new scenario for Bond, because you can't adapt the existing books for the screen. And he was right about that, because when Broccoli and Saltzman came on the screen, the Bond novels, even though the early ones retain the basic storyline, they are very different, aren't they? They are changed quite considerably. So I think McClory had a lot of foresight, and but I can't think of anyone else really who had a deep influence than the ones we've already mentioned, really.
Okay. Well, I had a question. Thunderball is your favorite Bond film, the guilty pleasure Bond, if you will, but the one you probably go back to a fair amount.
Yes, I think yes, we'll say guilty pleasure.
Yeah. When you look at these drafts that are written, in the early, like 1961, what do you see as the key differences between these drafts and the movie you now treasure?
Um, well, there was an interesting in one of the drafts. They were going to have the Harry Truman was going to open the film with a warning about nuclear war and almost like
Right.
a disarmament plea, a plea for disarmament. And Harry Truman, of course, was the president who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course. It's not made plain in the script whether that it is going to be the real Harry Truman. I presume it was going to be the real Harry Truman. It would have been a bit weird to have an actor playing Harry Truman because we don't know what Harry Truman looks like anyway, do we? So I presume that it was. And Ernest Cuneo had a lot of connections in the American government. So I think he probably would have been able to pull a few strings. So probably they would have got him. And it was going to be in the White House. He was going to be talking from the White House. So there are some odd things like that in it. But pretty much the flavour of that script is very much the flavour of the Thunderball that we know. A lot of it was. I think it was Kevin McClory who came up with the idea of hijacking instead of stealing the bomb from a rocket site, was to steal it midair. To hijack a plane. That was McClory's idea, and that was in the second draft. They put that in the second draft. I think because he'd read in the newspaper but one of these planes had gone missing or something, and then he was a great ideas man, like Saltzman. I think he was closer to Saltzman and closer to Broccoli. I think Kevin was an ideas man. I think he was always coming up with Bond can do this, and then that can happen, and he could use this gadget. He was that kind of person, and of course the plastic surgery thing is there. With the guy getting the identity of the NATO pilot. Yes, that's there. So yeah, most of the elements actually under scuba diving under the Disco Volante, that's there. There are differences. Bond is captured and thrown into a swamp, and is almost eaten by crabs. So
less dangerous than Golden Grotto sharks.
Exactly. So there's little elements, but the basic flavour is there pretty much. Yeah, but it's fascinating to read because it's like reading something very familiar, but it's not at the same time. If you see what I mean, Yeah.
So obviously you had that pile of goodies in the Whittingham house. That was really the sort of the element that turned the book into what it became. The story of Thunderball, the story of turning Bond onto the big screen. But were there any other sort of revelations outside of the Whittingham papers that you found along the way? I know there was a Bond fan that ended up staying at McClory's house and finding some treasures there.
Yeah, that was terrific. Yes, that was probably the best one actually, and that happened really close to publication. We delayed publication so that could get in because he got in touch. I don't know how he heard. He must have heard on the grapevine somehow that this book was being written, and he got in touch with me and he said he had lots of goodies for me, which he in fact did. And I met up with him, and he told me his story, which has a whole chapter in the book, which is a shame because in the book it's not his real name. That's the name of the guy in the book is not the real name. The guy asked me not to have it put his name, but the new edition that was going to be coming out this year We were going to name him. He said, "You can call me. I don't care now." So, but that's he's a bit disappointed that he can't be revealed. But there you go. But he stayed in Kevin's house in the Bahamas, and it's quite an adventure. And he came away with suitcases of stuff. Those pictures of Connery in New York, locations scouting for Warhead. Because there were piles and piles, cupboards and filing cabinets full of stuff, full of call sheets from Never Say and Thunderball, storyboards, you name it. There were hundreds and hundreds of original Thunderball letterheads. The script for Warhead was there, script for Thunderball was there. Never Say, you name it. There was so much stuff there. There was too much that he couldn't. He took as much as he could. And luckily, because the place was destroyed, the place was demolished, and I think it's now a sports complex or something.
Well, there's also the stuff that was in his yard that I found absolutely fascinating. It was like the scuba gear and stuff. Yeah.
There was the sled, the bomb sled was in the garden, rusting away, and he took photographs of that. That was in the original book. The Vulcan bomber model that crashed, that actually hit the sea. That was in the garage, and he took a picture of that with the naked dog to get for scale.
Dog for scale. Nice.
Amazing. And there is one of the little toes. Yeah, one of the underwater toes was there as well. Crazy. It's a shame. You can imagine if he could have brought one of those things back with him. I don't think he would have got a bomb sled through customs. I think they might have asked a few questions.
Especially nowadays, I think there would have been some issues. But you just think of how much the sort of memorabilia props industry has changed.
Absolutely.
In the last 15 years. Now people are, all these prop store auctions and stuff, people are paying hundreds of thousands just to maybe have a shirt that Connery wore once.
Absolutely. If that would have been maybe even 5 years later, he would have been worth phoning someone up and getting a delivery service to ship it to the UK. It would have cost hundreds of pounds, but it would have been worth it.
Yeah, just a Vulcan bomber alone, someone would have paid real money to have that in their living room.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a shame.
So would you say that and the Whittinger Papers were the two sort of main eureka moments during creating the book?
I think so. And also, I interviewed a lot of people. I did. I interviewed Ken Adam and people like that. Irving Kershner I interviewed, Barbara Carrera, who I know you've spoken to, a few other people, Luciana I interviewed. So it was lovely to get Earl Cameron, who played Pinder in Thunderball. So it was lovely getting memories of shooting those movies. Got some very amusing stories, so that's always lovely. It's always lovely to firsthand people who are actually there, can tell amusing stories, because it was great. It was great fun shooting Thunderball. What an amazing place to make a movie. The Bahamas. You say we're gonna make a movie for you're going to be 3 months making this movie, but it's going to be in the Bahamas. I can live with that. You're staying in four-star hotels, and Terence Young was a real, he was Fleming-esque and Bond-esque. A lot of people have said that Terence Young was very Bond-like, and there would be champagne flowing. They'd film a scene on the beach, and they'd say "cut champagne," and there'd be a little marquee, and suited up servants serving ice cold champagne in between setups.
It's a hard life.
It was tough.
Yeah. I don't know how they did it.
Yeah. But horrible as well for Connery, because of course the whole world's press went there, of course, as well.
Which was the problem in You Only Live Twice as well. He was just ambushed.
Well, he was the biggest star in the world. When they were making Thunderball, he was the biggest star in the world. Movie star. Probably the most famous man on the planet.
It's fascinating reading the Roger Moore diaries, I think it's what, 007 diaries from Live and Let Die, and much as I've heard they're slightly embellished, in postscript they are certainly, but hearing how much of the job of playing Bond is just him talking to reporters most of the time,
Yeah.
as opposed to actually shooting scenes.
Yes. Well, don't forget he was the new Bond, wasn't he? So I guess because I remember when I was a freelance journalist and when GoldenEye came out, it was very easy to get an interview with Pierce because when Tomorrow Never Dies came out, it was a little bit more difficult. Because when it's your first Bond, you literally will talk to Gardeners Weekly. You'll talk to anybody who wants to talk to you. By Thunderball, Connery didn't do any interviews. He refused. All the other girls did. If you go back to the hotel, they probably spent an hour, 2 hours talking to reporters. Connery never did. He said, "I'm not talking to anybody," and he didn't.
Well, that was something Craig said he had a lot of trouble with. Was once Casino Royale blew up, of really dealing with that sort of attention.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of like not talking to people, as Connery was doing, you mentioned some of the names you got to talk to, and some people that aren't with us anymore. So it's always invaluable having those Ken Adams and stuff. It's just invaluable to have those conversations. Was there anyone you approached? I imagine there must have been a couple because we've had rejections over the years too. Was there anyone you approached for this book in particular, especially when you had a flavour of what was going to happen with the Whittingham papers and stuff, that you said, "Hey, would you speak to me?" And they were like, "No." Did you hit that wall?
Claudine, I tried to get Claudine Auger, but she said no, which was fine. But when you're talking about a film from 1965, obviously Broccoli and Saltzman were gone, Terence Young was gone. A lot of people were already not with us. So it was, but most of the people I tried to get hold of were happy to talk. Actually, I spoke to Lamore Boren, who was the guy and Jordan Klein, who did all the underwater stuff. Jordan Klein was a great interview. He invented the underwater jetpack, and that's a great story. In the battle when he jumps out of the top turn and then he flies like a Superman under the water. He's got this sort of huge jetpack on, and that was Jordan Klein's idea. He was a guy. He was an engineer, and he built the bomb sled. He did all of that stuff, and then he came in one day and said, You got this big underwater battle. What's Bond's gadget for the battle and underwater? What's his Aston Martin? What have you got for him?" And they said, "Well, we haven't got anything for him. He just goes in a scuba." And he said, "Look, give me 10 days and I'll come up with something." And he came up with the underwater jetpack. I think they gave him. He said, "Give me $50,000. Was it 15,000? I don't know. 50,000 sounds a lot, doesn't it? Even for 65. But it was a lot of money. It was several thousand quid. He said, "Just give me the money and I'll come up with something. And if you don't like it, I'll pay for it." And he came up with this, and because it worked, it actually worked. Didn't go really fast under the water. There was a motor, but it was a bit pathetic. It was like a bit of a banger car. So in the end, what they had to do, I'm sure that in the end, what they had to do was they got a piano wire attached to the pack, which was attached to a speedboat on the water, and the speedboat pulled him really fast under the water. But there was a motor in it. It did have its own power. It wasn't good enough for James Bond. It wasn't particularly fast. And I love one of my favourite scenes one of my favourite moments in the film is when he comes into the battle really fast, and there's all these people fighting, and he roars in and he just takes the guy's scuba mask off. It's so good.
One of the having spoken to people on the show over the years that have done documentaries about Bond or other spy movies or written books about Bond, one thing I always like to ask is, did the process of making this book reframe Thunderball for you in a way, or Never Never Again, or any of that sort of saga of Bond?
What do you mean by reframe? Sorry.
Well, as in, I suppose, probably a poorly reframed question. I suppose in the sense of, like, you learned so much about it. You knew some things. You learnt more from the Whittingham papers and such. But, I think also the book itself is a history lesson in what Bond could have been.
Yeah.
And the opportunities that had existed and what McClory was bringing to the table and all sorts of other things that you learn about Ian Fleming. And I suppose, did the process of making the book change your perspective on, like, maybe increase your appreciation for what was achieved with Thunderball?
Yeah. Well, what I think what it made me think is I thank God for Broccoli and Saltzman. I think it was the main, and I think I say it in the book um, that I don't think it would have worked with McClory. Um, I think it would have been a failure, and I think Bond wouldn't. It wouldn't have, we wouldn't be talking about Bond now. I think we were so lucky to get that Broccoli and Saltzman arrived because they were the perfect people. I think that's the main thing that I came away with after all that research was in the end the right people got to make the first Bond film,
Right.
and that was Broccoli and Saltzman because Kevin was still banging away. He was still this really irritating hornet, trying to sting you. He was still buzzing around. And as I say, Broccoli and Saltzman were perfect. Writing the When Harry Met Cubby book. But yes, it gave me a renewed appreciation, as you say. We've reframed my appreciation of Broccoli and Saltzman and what they did and what they achieved, and they might not have got their hands on it if Kevin, if it all had been plain sailing, and they'd got a backer. I think what happened was that another reason why Fleming started getting restless with McClory was that I think film studios and American television were starting to get interested in Bond. So they were starting. Fleming's agents started getting, big producers and film companies and TV companies asking about the Bond rights. They were stuck with this guy, Kevin McClory. He didn't really know or didn't have the experience. That was another reason why they wanted to get rid of him, because they thought Bond is actually becoming a hot property for some reason. So
And on the topic of McClory, I think it's an interesting one because we've sort of spoken about it already, that his name is very much derided in Bond circles. He's the butt of many jokes. He's definitely seen as a negative force in the world of James Bond.
I think the reason for that was that people didn't know the whole story. I think they always thought he was I think they always thought he was an interloper, and maybe that why does he have the rights to do this? Why does he say that he? And I hope my book, because again we're talking about Fleming being flawed. McClory was flawed, deeply flawed human being, but he came pretty close. He came pretty close to doing it. So he wasn't really an interloper at all. He was there. What could have been the beginning of the Bond films, but quirk of fate, and it never happened for him. But a different outcome. He would. But as I say, I don't think his Bond film would have worked. I think it would have been it would have lasted maybe 2 or 3 films at the most. Particularly if James Stewart bloody played it. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Must have been a bitter pill for him to swallow, though, because he does have a producer credit on Thunderball.
Yeah.
He's there working on it. It's the biggest box office explosion for Bond, for a long time to come, and then he's gone for You Only Live Twice. They're like, okay, you did your movie. See you later. Goodbye.
He was lucky, though, to some extent, because
yeah.
He obviously, when he won the plagiarism case, so he got the film rights to Thunderball, and he tried to set it up on his own. But then he knew that by then Connery was Bond, so no matter who he got, he talked to Richard Burton. Richard Burton was interested, but even Marlon Brando, it wouldn't have mattered who he got. Everybody wanted Sean Connery as Bond, so he knew that. So he decided that he would join forces with Broccoli and Saltzman, and he was lucky that they agreed to do his film straight away. So they'd just done Goldfinger, and Goldfinger was such a huge success in America. So any film that came after Goldfinger was going to go through the roof. So he was lucky in that respect, that Bond was at its absolute peak of popularity in the mid-60s when Thunderball came out. I think if any film had come out, any Bond film had come out in 1965, it would have been the biggest of all time. And Thunderball, I think, is still the most successful Bond film for bums on seats. I think someone said 50 million tickets were sold in America.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, for Thunderball. Yeah. So I think Skyfall has overtaken it, I think, financially, but I think for ticket sales, Thunderball still is number one. Yeah, it's astonishing, really. But he was around all the time. I mean, his whole life afterwards was sort of devoted to Bond, wasn't it? He made so much money from Thunderball because the profits he earned from it were astronomical. I mean, he could have done whatever he wanted to do. He could have, created his own film studio in Ireland. He could have done whatever wanted to do, but he sort of threw it all away on ridiculous court cases, and it turned out to be sort of a life, a wasted life, really.
I suppose then, because we could talk about Thunderball some more, and I do think one of the things about Thunderball and having McClory as the sole producer is an interesting element, because I think ultimately, despite him having that, I don't get the impression he had much say on set.
No, on Thunderball,
yeah,
not really. No, but he lived in the bar by then. He'd been living in the Bahamas, so he knew a lot of people. So he was invaluable for contacts, for getting hotels. The Lagos home, Palmyra, with the shark pool. They were friends of McCloy. The people who I think it was the Sullivans, the very rich American couple, who were alcoholics. It's a funny story, I'll tell you in a minute. And I think he got permission to use their house. So I think he was invaluable for knowing where the best places were on the island to shoot and getting permission. And the Sullivans had that swimming pool which they had sharks in, and the Bond team were filming there for about a week. And usually the people in the house sort of leave, don't they, and let the production take over. But the couple wanted to stay because they wanted to watch the filming, and they were quite elderly, and she was a bit of a alcoholic, so they were a bit worried that she would get a little bit tipsy at night and fall in the shark pool. So they had to have someone sort of a bodyguard watching her, totter about after her 7 gin and tonics. She wouldn't fall in the shark pool and get eaten. Because after 7 gin and tonics, you forget, don't you, that your swimming pool has sharks in it. Yes.
Or you feel slightly invulnerable to the sharks. You're like, oh, I could take him if I fell in. I'm a good swimmer. It'll be fine.
It's only a movie. No, they're real sharks. They're not rubber. They're real sharks.
Yeah.
That's a great scene as well, isn't it? When they have the fight and they fall in the swimming pool, and there's that tunnel connecting it to the shark pool, and the sharks come in, and there's no music. It's very, very, very sort of understated music score there. Really, it's a superb scene. It's
Great.
Very atmospheric sequence.
And I suppose then, like, taking that story on to its next iteration, which is Never Say Never Again, and there were, the agreement was you had to wait X amount of years, and then there was the attempts with Warhead and Len Deighton, which I think is a very interesting story in itself, because Len Deighton, creator of many spy stories, created the Harry Palmer character, although not that name, but has its own spy legacy in cinema too. Len Deighton's a big name, and they worked very closely with Len and Sean coming up with that other version of the film that never quite saw the light of day. We saw something else with Never Say Never Again. And I think the book does a good job of sort of laying that story out. But for you, do you think that film would have been successful had that Len Deighton, Sean Connery sort of story come about?
I think so, because I think any Bond film at the time was going to be a success, wasn't it? Particularly with Connery coming back. So I think people, even though critically it might have been not particularly well received, but I think people don't. Oh, we won't go and see the new Bond film. It didn't get a very good review. You go and see it, don't you? You go and see the new Bond film, whatever. So I think it would have been a success. I think it's an interesting script. I think it would have made, dare I say it, a more interesting film than Never Say, which was just a retread of Thunderball.
Yeah.
So it was something different. It was a new kind of film. It has some interesting things in it, like mechanical sharks with laser beams, which I'm sure influenced the Austin Powers. Someone definitely read Warhead script and put that in Austin Powers without a doubt, because you actually have mechanical sharks, in the sewers of Subway and in New York in the sewers. And the Statue of Liberty. There's a base on the Statue of Liberty, and goodness knows what. And there was an very Spy Love Me. There's sort of an Atlantis base that sort of rises, and which I think ultimately is the reason it was never made, wasn't it? I think Broccoli sued because it had elements of the Spy Love Me. So I think that's one of them.
Which ironically was sort of co-opted from a script that he had done by Jerry Anderson in the 60s. That the Spy Love Me had already taken elements from something else. So it's a bit of a mess, that whole story, for sure. And I note like the sort of Statue of Liberty thing is eventually reused in a non-Bond film. I think Peter Hunt directed it. Remo, which I think is
Remo, yes.
A fascinating chapter in the Bond film history that's not quite connected, but it has a lot of Bond connective tissue in that film.
It was Guy Hamilton.
Oh, Guy Hamilton, thank you.
I'm sure these scripts are passed around Hollywood, aren't they? So people get to read them, and then in 5 years' time, you get this little element that creeps. Oh yeah, Statue of Liberty would be a really good sort of ending to a spy movie. Have a fight on the top of it. So yes, I'm sure that's what happens. If a script isn't filmed, then you can nick all the ideas, I suppose.
We've had quite a few screenwriters on over the years that have said like, "Oh, I had this idea and it ended up in The Matrix and stuff." And you think, maybe it didn't, but you could definitely claim it. There's no way to prove you're right or wrong, I suppose.
Yeah.
And like getting into Never Say Never Again, as I said at the beginning, I'm a bit of an apologist for that film, and I don't want to spend time sort of digging into the depths of that because that's not what this is about. But I think one thing that fascinates me about this later chapter of the Thunderball story is the fact that Sean puts his trust in Kevin, and that sort of that partnership lasts for quite a while. You've got the Warhead script in the 70s moving into the 80s, and we get Never Say Never Again. What is it? And we had a listener question. We've had a few listener questions that I built in. So this one's from Owen Ling, and he asked basically, did Connery warm to McClory due to their sort of shared Celtic heritage? And I suppose adding to that, what was the connection between the two of them?
I think so. I think going back to Thunderball, I think Connery warmed to Kevin. I think the Celtic connection I think helps. I think they were both working class. By Thunderball, Connery was. The hatred was starting with his hatred of the producers. I think I think on Goldfinger it was sort of bubbling, but I think on Thunderball it sort of reached. I mean, obviously, Only Twice it reached boiling point, but I think on Thunderball the relationship was almost pretty much going. So he spent a lot of time, Sean, on location with Kevin, not with Harry and Cubby. So I think he warmed to Kevin, and then when it was a masterstroke, actually, when you think about it, because Kevin obviously wanted for Warhead wanted Connery back as Bond, and that's really what the Hollywood backers wanted as well. Sean said no, he wasn't returning. So what Kevin did was say, well, then why don't you come and write the script? Help write the script. And Sean thought that was an interesting idea, and it was very clever because obviously. That was Kevin's way of getting him in, getting his. But he'll work on the script, and he'll probably change his mind. And the fact that Lynn Dayton, who Connery respected, was involved as well. So that was a clever ploy on Kevin's part. I think Connery left the Warhead project because it was just too many lawyers, so he walked off it, and it died. And then when Kevin resurfaced with Never Say Never Again. Although it wasn't really Kevin producing Never Say, it was Jack Schwartzman, wasn't it? Jack, because Kevin was executive producer, he didn't really have any creative control of the film at all. It was Jack Schwartzman who bought the rights off Kevin, really. So I think Connery did it as well. I think the $35 million he was being paid was probably an inducement, but also maybe he felt he owed Kevin. Something as well, but it turned out to be a horrendous experience for Connery. He hated filming it. He hated it. He didn't get on with Jack Schwartzman. He thought it was a very badly organised and very badly produced film, and that's why if you look at his filmography, he takes almost a 3-year sabbatical before coming back. His next film is Highlander, I think, in '86. So he took 3 years off. Because
I didn't notice that. Okay.
He was so pissed off. And when Connery gets pissed off, it usually lasts about 3 years.
I think it's a real shame that now the rights are all owned by Amazon. They have the rights to all these films, and we're talking, and they just announced a 4K restoration of all the Connery films in a 6-movie pack, not 7.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I can understand some purists saying, "Oh, it's not official," blah blah blah. It is the official Bond film; it has the license to do so. I think it is a real shame that it will never be brought into that circle, because it is Sean Connery playing James Bond in a fully fledged film. It has credentials. Owen Kirshner's directing it; it has stuff going for it. Edward Fox is there.
Yeah, the thing is with Never Say Never Again, it's the mad brother in the attic. I'm afraid that's how it's viewed. Because I worked with Vic Armstrong on his memoirs, and he would tell me that when he started, because he worked on Never Say Never Again, Vic. He did he was the stunt guy on it. And when he started working on the Pierce Brosnan Bond films, if he mentioned Never Say Never Again, Barbara and Michael would look at him and say, "Don't swear."
Oh,
that's how it was treated. You weren't allowed to bring it up, And I think that's the sort of attitude that they have towards it. Really, it exists, but they rather it didn't.
do you think that evaporates now with Amazon taking over? And
I think so. It'd be nice if they bring it out as a separate 4K, maybe on its own.
Sure.
yeah.
I sort of understand why it's not in why it's not in with the 6, because they're of the canon, should we say? They are Eon United Artists. They've got the Bond theme. They've got the gun barrel. Because Never Say doesn't have any of that.
No.
It doesn't have. Yeah. So that's why, for me, it always feels. I mean, I like it as well. I agree with you. I quite like it as well. I think it's got some good stuff in it. But it doesn't feel like a Bond film, even though Connery's there. It doesn't have. Yeah, it doesn't have the Bond theme, the gun barrel. It doesn't. I don't think it has the epic sweep either of a Eon film. It just doesn't have the flavour. And I think, in the end, that is what I think is its major flaw. Because I remember there's an interview Irving Kershner gave that he said he'd never watched any of the Bond films because he didn't think he had to. He just filmed the script. And I think that was, a mistake in a way.
Yeah.
I can understand because why he didn't do that, but he thought, I'm making a film and the character in the script is called James Bond, so let's go. But there have been films before, and I think you need to sort of watch those and to some extent they should dictate the film because it's a Bond film and they have a style. Never Say didn't have the style of an Eon film.
No, and I don't think we should get into Casino Royale 67 in this conversation. I think we'd be here for years trying to untangle that.
Yeah, that's a guilty pleasure. I actually like that.
There's nothing guilty about pleasure.
It's a mess.
Well, except that case.
Well, it is a mess.
It's a mess. It's an absolute mess, but it's a glorious mess. I love it.
It looks great. I will always defend it for it's far better looking than some official Bond films. I think the cinematography is spectacular at times in that film.
Yeah, I mean it's great, and the score's great, fantastic, and Woody Allen. Woody Allen's the baddie. I mean, come on.
Yeah,
and he's brilliant. I mean, the last 5 minutes with him cracking all those gags is just brilliant. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Another listener question that came in, and a little bit it confused me the question, but I'm going to pose it to you as written, and we can maybe decipher it because I didn't remember seeing this in the book. But James Atkinson asks, what did Eon make of the attempts to film with Brosnan in the late 80s with Kevin McClory?
Oh yes.
Now I wasn't aware of this, but was there an attempt made?
Yeah, I mean, he also did some commercials, didn't he? In that period was it for Japanese cigarettes, where he was sort of a very Bond-like person being attacked by ninjas and stuff.
Okay.
And I think Eon sued. I think the advert was taken off the air.
Oh wow.
Because he was sort of that's obviously a James Bond person. So Pierce was doing things like that. But I don't think that I don't know how far it went with the warhead thing with Pierce. I'm not sure how far it went.
Because there was a later version with Dalton, of course, in the 90s that was.
There was, yeah, there was, yeah. And again, um, whether that was, whether they were seriously involved or not, I don't know. Because there's very little information about, you know, about how. Of course, you do have the Irish connection, of course, don't you, with Pierce and Kevin? So maybe Kevin played the Irish card to Pierce,
I have to imagine there's a slight bitterness with Pierce in the 80s after like giving daylights and then it being taken away just because of the messing around with Remington Steele.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. Although that wasn't the Bond people's fault, really. It was
No.
the Steel people, wasn't it? But obviously,
No.
he might have thought that, they could have waited a bit for me. They could have, So yeah, I don't know. And Pierce has never talked about it, really, has he? Isn't it in interviews?
No. I was wondering. I think that's why so James asked really. So if you knew anything about it.
Yeah. No. I wish I had some more information. I wish I had a revelation. It would have been in the book if I'd had it. And it seemed a bit, going after Pierce, who doesn't really give many interviews. Although I have interviewed him, he's quite a good interviewer, actually. Interviewee.
There you go, folks. That was Robert Sellers, Part 1.
That's right. And folks, you aren't going to believe the treasures to come in Part 2.
You'll be swimming into the depths with Barbara Carrera or with Claudine Auger, whichever version you prefer.
Or Fiona Volpe, whichever one. Yeah, Luciana Paluzzi.
Oh, yeah. Anyone you'd like to go swimming with, we will be swimming with them later this week.
That's right. There's going to be a lot of swimming, ultimately, is what we're saying. And frankly, we're treading water with this postscript.
Well, it is Thunderball. It is all about waiting around in water for too long.
That's true. We are waterlogged at this point.
I can't get it out of my ears. No, I think that was a great Part 1. I'm interested to hear what you all think about cutting them in half as well. I want to hear from you folks. Drop us an email, contact@spyhards.com if you have any feedback about cutting them in half. I'm just curious to hear everyone's thoughts on that. But let's just talk about the chat for a little bit, because the first half of this is really about the story of Thunderball, and it's quite a big story and a lot of things people don't know that went into what would have been the first James Bond movie.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases we'd say, you know what, folks? That was the teaser. Go read the book. But we can't really do that right now because the book, unfortunately, not so much around.
No, there are a few copies out there you can find online for ridiculous prices. I stumbled into my own copy of it for quite a reasonable price, we'll put it that way. And we'll get into more of the history of the book itself later this week with Part 2. But, I think people who are Bond fans who maybe haven't really dived into the depths of the Thunderball story will be surprised by some of the things that were sort of spoken about in this discussion. From Alfred Hitchcock's involvement, wanting Jimmy Stewart to play Bond. I'm not sure I want to live in a world where Jimmy Stewart is 007.
I got a license to kill.
That was actually a pretty good Jimmy Stewart.
It's not bad.
Whoa, Jimmy, what are you doing here?
I feel like it's vacillating between Jimmy Stewart and Bill Clinton.
I was about to jump in with like a Nixon impression because I can't do Clinton, but I don't know how that connects.
Yeah, it was a little wobbly. There's times I could do it better, but yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, everyone kind of knows about the Thunderball Never Say Never Again elements, right? Because that's a movie you discover, often like me, when you're a younger Bond fan and you watch Never Say Never Again and go, wait a second, I've seen this movie.
Wind it back, folks. I've seen this.
Yeah, like, wait, I could predict how Largo was going to die. That's not right. And so, like, it is kind of that early kind of Bond fan, I think, at least it was in my generation, kind of thing where you're like, wait, what's going on here? And you get the details and go, I understand. But you kind of don't understand because the story is so much more complex, and it's not just related to it produced these two films. It's like, as you said, there's the early version of, Warhead or Thunderball or whatever you want to call it. The early versions that Ian Fleming is working on with, other writers. And you've got like Jack Whittingham developing a lot of the concepts that would become quite crucial to the story as well. A writer whose name does not get thrown around a lot in Bond circles the way that Kevin McClory's does. And so I think there's a lot of great information in this interview about that, but also just that, like, it didn't end there. You know, you had the Warhead story being developed in the future as well as a potential project. You know, Len Dayton attached to it. And the idea that, like, in an alternate universe, we have, like, 27 versions of Thunderball at this point in time is I was going to say terrifying alternate reality, but then I look at all these sequels and remakes coming out in theaters every year, and I'm like, wait, maybe we do live in that reality.
Well, I mean, they remade A New Hope, and it made a ton of money.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they could do it again.
Yeah. I mean, and, you know, like, that's the case for so many things.
Is A Force Awakens the popular, like, successful version of Never Say Never Again?
In box office and everything, in terms of, like, appreciation, yes. I would say the other one is Jurassic World.
Yeah?
Which was financially very successful, although Never Say Never Again was too.
Well, Never Say Never Again was okay. It made its money, but didn't make much more. It didn't really spur them on to make another one.
Right, and made less than Octopussy, which was the notable thing that year.
Yeah, but I suppose, I mean, like, there is a world where they could have made another version of Thunderball after Never Say Never Again, or before, but after, and it had been successful, like, actually successful.
Yeah?
Because, like, people say Force Awakens is a good film. People say Jurassic World is a good film.
I mean, Jurassic World is trash, but I went not too long ago to a orchestra performance of Force Awakens. And, you know, where the orchestra's on stage and they play the music, or they play the movie, and then the music is done by the orchestra. And I've gone to see the original Star Wars trilogy perform that way as well.
Yeah.
And Force Awakens, it was a sold-out audience, and the amount of cheers through the movie, the amount of excitement, it was very clear to me, while I don't share that adoration for that movie, that in that room, it was a very special experience for a lot of people.
I just want to see the scene where Largo walks onto the deck of the Disco Volante and goes, "Domino, we're home."
Fanfare.
Yeah, you just get those, like, those reaction videos online of just those geeks who watch it on YouTube going, "Oh my god!" The reaction faces, like, "Ah, I can't believe it! I can't believe they got so and so to play Largo. Oh no!"
I feel like there's a bit of a difference in the pop culture love between Han Solo and Chewbacca and Largo and Domino, but
I don't know. Like, you extrapolate that to Bond fans, and you, like, maybe dial it down by the amount of Bond fans in the universe. I'd say, like, Largo and Domino are pretty popular characters.
Would you say that's the Han Solo and Chewbacca of the James Bond universe?
I don't know if I go out on that ledge. Wait, who is then? Who is?
Is it like Q? Maybe Q is one of them.
Q feels like he'd be like 3PO or R2-D2 or something.
But, like, I was thinking maybe Q and Moneypenny. Like, that might be because, like, Luke is the star of Star Wars, and Han and Chewbacca are essentially supporting characters.
Which version of Q are we? No, Q, actually, I suppose. I was thinking of M for a second. Like, are you getting, like, the drunk version of M who walks into his office and he's like, "Moneypenny, we're home," but Moneypenny's not there and he's just drunk and passes out on the floor.
Yeah, like the grouchy M from Man with the Golden Gun.
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah.
I mean, we've spun off here, but I absolutely love this idea of Domino and Largo on the Millennium Falcon.
And of course, like, she has to have the black and white, like, swimwear on because it has to be representative of what it's always been within that universe. And I guess, well, Largo's gonna have an eye patch, obviously.
Obviously, yeah, it has to be,
and be dubbed.
The mouth doesn't quite match up.
Exactly.
We've manifested something purely evil into the universe, and I love it.
Oh my god.
If someone can make that happen with, like, AI, I mean, I don't like AI, but I would kind of want to see that just for that moment.
All worth it. That would justify AI single-handedly.
Will Smith eating spaghetti walked so we could run with this. This is gold. Okay, well, speaking of gold, it was great to speak with Robert for an hour and a half about the story of Thunderball, but we have to tell the story of the book too, because the book, The Battle for Bond, I think has a legacy all its own.
Mm-hmm.
One that they'll probably make a film of one day, I'm sure. And that's what part 2 is. We basically get into the machinations of putting the book out, putting it together, the litigation from Ian Fleming's found like a company or estate or whatever it is, and also the third life it was meant to have. It was meant to be re-released this year. You'll note it hasn't been.
Right.
And we get into exactly why, and you will be shocked as to why it is not being put out again. I'll just leave it there.
And it is like kind of a whirlwind story in the same way that like the Thunderball controversy in the Bond universe is kind of like the dark period in the Bond franchise that continued to span across the life of that franchise. This sort of the events that tied to the Battle for Bond are this fascinating chapter that do cast a shadow that continues to go forward over that story.
And it may slightly change your take and your opinion on the Ian Fleming estate.
Might. You'll have to tune in to find out.
Oh, that's the teaser. So, your mission, folks, should you choose to accept it, I haven't got to ask Cam, is to tune in later this week for part 2 of our chat with Robert Sellers. There are stories to tell, there is tea to spill, and it will be spilled. It'll be everywhere.
I'm covered. Help.
It burns. It burns. Cam had an iced tea, but I had hot tea because I'm British.
Right. Yes, of course.
So yes, tune in later this week for part 2 with Robert Sellers. Thank you all for tuning into part 1 though. I hope you had a good time with it. If you want to support the show, come and join us over on our Patreon. Patreon.com/Spyhards, where you can get lots of bonus goodies over there, over 100 bonus episodes. But I think most importantly, you can keep me and Cam with a little bit of cash so we can pay for the heating this winter.
I'm so cold. Those Bahama dreams aren't keeping me warm, Scott.
They really aren't. Well, the fact is, you're not in the Bahamas. It's a fever dream from being so cold.
That's right.
Okay, it's not that bad, folks, but it was a joke. Anyway,
I like how it's like like springtime in Vancouver.
we're in the middle of a heat wave here in the UK as well.
It's sunny and beautiful outside my window at this very moment.
Never mind that. Join us over on social media at Spyhards, wherever you get your social media. We're probably there lurking in the shadows, probably trying to post something that gets no attention whatsoever, because that's how the algorithms work these days. Sigh.
Yes.
But until next time, folks, Cam and I are off to push ChatGPT to its extremes by trying to bring to life our vision for Domino and Largo on the Millennium Falcon.